Cheryl, love has never been a popular movement. And that always stuck with me because we
Mm.
like to think, oh, we need to have these mass movements. We have to get everybody on our side. But at the end of the day, if you look at historically, who has helped make change for justice and human rights and civil rights and animals and the environment, it's a really small group. It's never been a popular movement. And that's okay. It's incredible what small groups of people can do to make a difference.
Welcome to the Better Life for Animals podcast, where we amplify the voices of animal advocates, sanctuaries, and changemakers working toward a kinder, more compassionate world. Through powerful stories and expert insights, we shine a light on the efforts to rescue, protect, and advocate for animals. Be sure to subscribe wherever you're watching or listening. Every follower helps us reach more people. And support animal sanctuaries. Enjoy the conversation.
Will Potter is an award-winning investigative journalist and TED Senior Fellow who investigates political repression, civil liberties abuses, and the crackdown on protest and press freedom. His work has appeared in major outlets like The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and Rolling Stone. Will's work has helped overturn prosecutions and challenge censorship laws and led to testimony before legislatures in the US, Australia, and Europe. His first book, Green is the New Red, showed how governments and corporations label nonviolent activists as terrorists, while his new book, Little Red Barns, draws on a decade of research into factory farms and rising fascism. Shaped by his roots in the hardcore punk scene and collaborations with bands like Rise Against the Machine, Potter has also held prestigious academic roles at the University of Michigan and the University of Denver. Well, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Cheryl.
In your book, you talk about that happy little red barn image that we all think we know and how it's used to keep us complacent. Would you describe a moment in your reporting when that cozy image completely broke for you and what you actually saw happening to the animals?
No, I appreciate that. I think most people listening to this, I was raised with that narrative. I had the picture books and the little Fisher Price play set and Old MacDonald. And I've been covering these issues for many years, and I was a professor at the University of Michigan, actually with a special appointment researching and teaching storytelling. So I was immersed in stories, but didn't see the story of this little red barn right in front of me. So that turning point for me was I was commuting by motorcycle back and forth I actually lived on a farm in rural Michigan and go into the university and every day back and forth. And then finally one day I just saw those little red barns. And, it's one of those things, I don't know why it clicked all of a sudden, but it made me realize that perhaps this is the reason that we're not seeing. There's so many things I talk about in this new book, Little Red Barns, about censorship and misinformation, but ultimately what's keeping us in the dark are these false narratives that are being told.
I love this book, Will.
Oh,
Many
thank you
people
so much.
say, oh, it's amazing. I love the fact that you're looking at a new way to unhook a problem that we just don't seem to be able to uncover. What is it that's keeping us stuck? So I thought that was, because I too grew up and raised my children on, Old MacDonald
hmm
and that pull out toy where the animals would sing, oh goodness.
Oh, yeah, I know. I had one of those too.
Yeah.
And, my nieces do. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like we all kind of were raised this way, but I don't think we really give it much thought.
Well, they're just not living those happy lives.
No, not at
Unless
all.
they're in a sanctuary. I don't know where that's happening right now.
Well, and I'm sure, as most of your followers and listeners know, this is not how animals are raised for
No.
food. The dominant system is factory farming. More than 10 billion animals every single year are raised and killed for food, and systems that are more like an industrial factory, if that. Industrial factories actually have safety standards and more regulations. These are unregulated systems for the most part, and they're nothing like that farm of our imagination. They're kind of this dystopian world, is how it felt to me being on a lot of these facilities of concrete and thousands of animals standing and living in their own waste around other deceased animals. And it's just so grim compared to what we're fed at the grocery store with those cute little images on products.
Most people will tell you that they love animals, but they still support factory farming through their food choices. And after all of your investigations, how do you understand that gap between what people believe and what they actually do? And what does that mean for the animals?
Oof, I really have struggled with that. That's part of why this project took so many years, is thinking and rethinking that question. And I don't begin to have the answers to it, but some of the pieces that I've arrived at are really this narrative. There's a literary theorist that I really loved, named John Gardner, and he talks about this idea of the vivid continuous dream. And what he means is when we binge watch a show on Netflix that we love, or a book series, it's because we get really pulled into the story and we're willing to disregard how fantastical it is, right? Whether it's Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or vampires or something else. And there's something about that power of story that gets us in kind of a trance state, I would argue. And I started to view this issue and so many others through that lens. And so I think that's part of why we have that disconnect. I think fundamentally people want to do good. They want to make good choices. They want to make smart choices. They want to buy healthy things for their family. And I think part of it is we know in our core what's really happening. And I think a lot of us aren't willing to actually look. And we comfort ourselves with this narrative so that we don't have to have these difficult kind of ethical dilemmas. But the key takeaway I have in Little Red Barns is we're all strong enough to look. We're able to look at the truth, and we're able to make a change.
I like that saying. I think it goes, plants have protein, animals have feeling, and people have a choice, which is
Yeah,
always true, right? Yeah, that's what keeps me
absolutely.
hopeful. It's like, well, things are really feeling kind of dark right now, but we have
Very
that
much.
choice and we can change on a dime. I have to believe that. But right now the laws are punishing whistleblowers and undercover investigators, and that's making it harder for the public to know what's going on. And how do these laws help people avoid facing animal suffering? And what should we everyday listeners, do to care about them?
And that's really where this project began for me. I've been reporting for many years on how protests in journalism were being classified as terrorism by the FBI, including, believe it or not, animal rights and environmental activists who have never harmed a human being were labeled as the number one domestic terrorism threat by the FBI. And then after my first book came out, I saw a radical expansion of that in these new Ag-Gag laws. Ag is for agriculture and gag means to silence, were being passed around the country that made it a crime to even document and photograph illegal activity happening on factory farms. And it was clearly a response to the power of undercover investigations, the media attention, the international uproar about the horrific standard industry practices that were being exposed. And an attempt to quite literally shoot the messenger, as the saying goes.
Mm.
Um, so to me, at the start of this project, it really reflected the power of documenting and the power of investigation. And then I started to question that more and more as time went on. But I would say to folks listening, what that means for us is the industry, and remember, this is a multi-billion-dollar agriculture industry that's being threatened by nonprofit groups and animal activists who have very little money and resources, but they're threatened by that exposure. And when we talk about hope in these dark times, that does give me hope. There is that power of bearing witness and exposing injustice that it really scares the daylights out of people in power.
Some days I feel like there's just not enough, and what great big slogan or logo could we come up with that would just trump all of them, literally. And
Yep.
then, but then we're such a small group where, the government is not backing us, so that's really hard to fight. But at the same time, being small, and yet clearly they're nervous about it. I think because we're speaking the truth.
Well, as soon as you said that, I think about this a lot, and it reminds me of an essay by James Baldwin, where he talks about how love has never been a popular movement. And that always stuck with me because we
Mm.
like to think, oh, we need to have these mass movements. We have to get everybody on our side. But at the end of the day, if you look at historically, who has helped make change for justice and human rights and civil rights and animals and the environment, it's a really small group. It's never been a popular movement. And that's okay. It's incredible what small groups of people can do to make a difference.
That's all. That sounds very hopeful. I like that. We have what can only be called rising authoritarianism going on right now. I mean, the current events say everything.
Yeah.
In simple terms, how are these systems similar in the way they use secrecy, control, and fear in keeping the public from asking questions?
I've really come to view these systems of factory farming and fascism as kind of two poles. They're the most extreme representations of how humans with factory farming engage with non-human animals, the most extreme abuses of power. And fascism at its core is that regarding other humans. So I think there's something here about these systems of oppression and violence, surveillance. They require consolidation of power, they require obedience, surveillance, and laws cracking down on protest and journalism. But it's more than just that kind of theoretical connection, though, because what I found in my research is that these two issues are actually directly linked. When I said the FBI was labeling animal activists as their number one domestic terrorism threat, they were told repeatedly, repeatedly by Congress, by the West Point Military Academy, by Department of Homeland Security, and by their own Inspector General in the Justice Department that focusing on nonviolent activists was letting violent threats like white supremacists and far-right groups go unchecked. And they deliberately did not change course. So I would argue, I hope we reach a point in this country where we have congressional hearings investigating the FBI's complicity in what we're seeing right now. This nightmare scenario was building over many years of the FBI and other agencies relentlessly going after people who are trying to act out of empathy and ignoring people that are acting out of racism and misogyny and targeting women and religious groups. And I could go on from there. It gets even worse than that because the history of these systems are so directly connected. The Border Patrol, and now what we have is ICE, grew out of farming and ranching. It was actually to protect ranch owners from so-called immigrant threats, people coming across the border and stealing their animals. So this got really messy for me of seeing all of these pieces kind of tangled up together. And part of what I really sought to do in this book is I'm not able to completely untie them, but to show this mess that we're in and that all of these issues are much more connected than we often think.
And it's all a bunch of misinformation to boot. It's like this isn't even accurate. The new food pyramid I'm thinking of right now,
Oh
and
my gosh.
that's just doubling down on the cruelty and
Yeah.
unhealthy, you know, food standards that I'm not going to believe, you're not going to believe, but our children are going to believe, and our
Yep.
systems are going to be fed. So it's just there's no place anymore where we have one, at least we know what the truth is. There's no one
That's
place
what
that you can trust.
that's what scares me more than anything right now, to tell you the truth. And my work is dark. I look at scary things. That's what I've always done. But this idea that like we're in this kind of post-truth, post-fact world, or it seems like so much of the country just doesn't care about what the science or the research or the evidence is. And, I guess we have to keep in mind that this Make America Healthy Again kind of nonsense that we're seeing comes from a place that I think there's still common ground with a lot of the folks that are being tricked into this. Of people are distrustful of big government and of corporations. They want more so-called natural products. They want things like food dyes and chemicals out. That's all a bridge between conversations like this and those crowds, but it's getting twisted and it's getting manipulated by people in power to push things like the carnivore diet and wrap that up with toxic masculinity and to be a real man you only eat meat and all this just nonsense. And I think we're in a difficult spot here because I think we need to call out those lies when we see them and also try to remember that I think a lot of the people that are getting tricked into that have some of the same values that we all do. I mean, they're wanting to make the good choices, but there's just so much misinformation and propaganda from the top.
You're listening to Better Life for Animals podcast. Our mission is to amplify the voices of animal advocates, sanctuaries, and changemakers working toward a kinder, more compassionate world. But we can't do it alone. We need your help. First of all, go ahead and subscribe to this channel wherever you're watching or listening. And then get involved by visiting betterlifeforanimals.com. That's betterlifeforanimals.com. Be sure to check out our blog, learn more about incredible sanctuaries, and explore our book section, where 100% of net proceeds from book sales are donated to sanctuaries. Every action you take helps to make a difference. And remember, subscribe to this channel. And now, back to the show.
If you're just joining us, we're speaking with Will Potter, and this is Better Life for Animals. Food labels and marketing, family farm, cage-free, humane, these phrases often make people feel better about what they're buying. I mean, I have friends who will say, I only eat cage-free, eggs. That's, So I just wonder, what do we wish shoppers would ask themselves when they see those labels so that they don't get misled?
And that's the trick here. I think we need to make sure that our good intentions aren't being co-opted by the industry. Because the truth is, all those terms are really lacking teeth. They lack enforcement mechanisms. Family farms, for instance, I talk about in the book Little Red Barns, they're not defined by the USDA in terms of their scale. It's just about their ownership. So in other words, if the primary owners of a factory farm are the family, then it is a family farm, even if it has 100,000 birds in one facility. And so to explain this, I go back to, I don't know about you, Cheryl, but I had to read The Jungle by Upton Sinclair in high school. This used to be assigned reading,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And we're kind of told, oh, this is really disgusting. And hey, and then when Upton Sinclair, a famous journalist, published this in 1903, everything changed and the food system changed and we got regulations. And what Sinclair actually saw, and he wrote the president about, is those regulations were co-opted by the industry to make consumers think that things have changed and to try to appeal to their good intentions, but they had no teeth behind it as well. So unfortunately, that was over 100 years ago. In a lot of ways, we're back in a similar situation where this is being fed back to us as, hey, don't worry, this is the product you want. It's family, it's organic, it's pasture raised, and there's no regulation behind that.
And right now we're being told that there's a war on protein.
Right, which I take a particular offense to as a vegan, but I'm also a weightlifter. Right, and and so I've heard this from every side, and most of the people at weightlifting gyms are not vegetarian or vegan, and so I've heard this in so many different ways, and this obsession with protein right now reminds me, like in the 1980s, when there was this obsession with low cal. And so you'd have all this like just pure junk food at the grocery store. There was a chocolate and sugary and fake sugar and all that stuff, but it was low cal. So it was pushed as like, oh, this is what you need. And it's just misinformation. The fact of the matter is, you can get more than enough protein, both for everyday life and for trying to make fitness and strength gains on a plant-based diet. And there's a lot of evidence that shows it's a much healthier form of protein that isn't connected to things like heart disease, prostate cancer in men, and I would argue it's also connected to things like depression and mental health. Connecting, consuming these products that just come from violence, that come from unhealthy systems.
And I think it's important for people to do their own research. And when you hear something that says, war on protein or real food or whole milk, you have to look at, well, who's paying for that? Who is behind that advertising campaign? Who are behind the lobbyists who are, not thinking about your health, quite frankly, and that's so important for people to take agency of their own health, their own information. There's so much disinformation out there, but we have a lot of solid science that supports what we're promoting here. But I know for myself, the number one standout reason why everyone should look at this is because otherwise it's cruel and unnecessary. These animals are suffering egregiously from the moment they're born to the moment to the end of their life, also that you can have a chicken McNugget or, an egg sandwich. It's just, if you really put those things together, I think people would be more inclined to find another option because there's so many others.
Well, and I saw that most in these last couple of years. We've heard this campaign of, well, plant-based products are so processed, right? That word processed is being used, which is really interesting because I've seen the processes that go into how animals are raised on factory farms. And it's very clear that the industry doesn't want to talk about those, right? This is a bait and switch. They don't want us to talk about those issues, like you said, Cheryl, and they also don't want to talk about the environmental impact, what it's doing to workers, to communities. So instead, they're kind of inventing these public relations campaigns and deflecting and saying, well, plant-based is processed, or, hey, we need, now there's all these attempts to restrict labels on things like soy milk. And they're acting like it's to protect consumers. And I'm sorry, but I've never met anyone that thought soy milk is a form of cow's milk, or thought that, it's just an invented problem to protect corporate profits.
And then there's also this piece about we want, immigrants out, and yet it's immigrants who support, because they have no other options. They're there actually doing this work. They're basically indentured servants in this food industry that's also not being talked about, as though we don't care. We don't care about those people, but we care about, others. It's just broken on so many levels.
Well, and then the more I tried to do my best to reflect the scope and the scale of that. I was brought into this through those ethical concerns and animal issues. The book opens with me seeing that first video footage, and it struck me to my core. But the more I've investigated this industry, for instance, there's repeated reports from international human rights organizations that workers on factory farms, as in slaughterhouses, as the slaughter speeds continue to increase, many workers have been forced to wear diapers as adults because they're not allowed bathroom breaks. There's repeated reports from human rights groups of human slavery and child trafficking to keep these, not just immigrants, but forced servitude to work in these facilities to keep supplying Americans with cheap animal products. And so when we talk about this idea of bearing witness and what it means to see, I think we have to see the whole thing. This is a system that's just rotten from top to bottom.
That's so well put. You have reported on activists, journalists, and communities who are threatened or silenced. And so, what have animal advocates learned about surveillance and repression that everyone should know, especially if they care about their basic rights and democracy?
And this is what's really motivating me right now to try to share my work that I've done over this 25 years now as we're watching this true nightmare unfold in the US. Because animal activists have, I would argue, animal and environmental activists have been on the receiving end of government repression and surveillance more than any other social movement post September 11th. And the scale of government and corporate collusion, harassment, surveillance, new terrorism legislation, secretive prison units, housing activists. We could go on for a long time about this. This has become the playbook. And so this is something that should concern not just the animal activists who are watching this right now, but I would really encourage people who are watching this to take that message outside of these communities and say, hey, if you're worried about what you're seeing on the street today, let's talk about kind of where this came from and some of the lessons that we learned and how this has become the new model of corporations and governments working together to try to shut down their opposition. And I think if there's any hope of us getting out of this mess, like we need to study this history right now and understand very clearly that what the agriculture industry has done of turning journalists and whistleblowers into terrorists is a playbook that they're trying to copy all over the world.
Bearing witness to animal suffering can be emotionally heavy and exhausting. So what has helped you stay present about compassion without shutting down? And what advice would you give listeners who are just starting to really look at this?
I really push myself in this book to be candid and quite vulnerable about that. I've really struggled over these years. And it got to some pretty dark moments for me, both in terms of my own mental health and depression and PTSD, but also in terms of my faith in that idea of bearing witness. Because it seems like we keep exposing this stuff over and over and over again, and it doesn't really change. The system doesn't change. The number of vegetarians doesn't seem to change that much. And so this all contributed. So I just say it, openly that I get it. I mean, if you're listening to this and it's overwhelming and you're feeling that kind of darkness, I think that is a valid human response to what we're witnessing. But we have to remember that I think I'll say I've come back to this concept of bearing witness and what I would describe a faith in it. Because we have to believe that if we're able to see something and be moved by it, then others can see it and be moved by it as well. And if we give up on that faith, I think we're giving up on a core of what it means to be a human being. So I've come to view this kind of act, not just in journalism, but what investigators are doing, what activists are doing, raising awareness. It's an act of spiritual defiance. It's a faith that other people, maybe not everybody, maybe not right away, it might take 100 times, it might take 5 years or however long for somebody to see it, but eventually people can see it too. And I think we just cannot give up on that.
Well, it seems like we're reaching a very critical time right now with so much unrest. Hopefully this is going to open people's eyes to other things that are going on that they may not and should not be trusting, to look at, what's on their plate, what's in their clothing, all these things that they don't need to do. They could be free of this. Because I personally find being vegan very freeing, and I'm thankful every day that I can say I didn't intentionally hurt an animal. So because we can only do what we can do. It's not necessarily going to be something that we can solve, and yet I do have hope. And books like what you have written and the work that you are doing, Will, is so important. I can't thank you enough for being
Appreciate
so
that.
courageous and articulate. And I hope everyone, please read Will Potter's book, both of them. They're excellent.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. And I feel the same way. The world is a dark place, but there's something really empowering about we can't control everything. We can't control a whole heck of a lot most of the time, but we can make choices about what we put in our body, and we can make choices about what we buy. And it's not enough. I don't think we should just be fixated on our put our blinders on of our own life and try to be as pure as possible and as vegan as possible. We have to be gentle with ourselves. We do the best we can, but taking that control of our lives through those small acts of kind of daily resistance is I think a muscle that we grow, right? It really it feels better and better to say no to violence you don't want to be part of, and to say yes to communities and a way of life that is more healthy and nurturing and in line with your values.
We interviewed Leah Garces last week, and I love how she says, and I often embrace this myself, that compassion is a muscle. And
Yeah.
somebody will start off maybe for their own health, and that's a very common way to get started. And then they recognize that this food is just very delicious. I feel better and I don't need that. And I think sometimes it's then that people are then able or willing to look and see what's going on beyond them. Before that, perhaps it's just too painful. I don't know. But I love the
So,
idea of, starting off with what you can do. And, I can speak for my vegan journey has certainly evolved. There was a time when just doing that was more than enough. But it doesn't stay that way, does it? Because the problem is massive. There aren't enough of us. So I, of course, am a big proponent of every ordinary person out there doing every single thing they can to help solve this just egregious problem. It's just such a disconnect. Someday we're going to say, we did what? But I don't know if that's anytime
I,
soon.
and it might not be, but I think we have to reach that point. And it reminds me, I'm glad you had Leah on the show. It reminds me hearing that of, I think I was on Rich Roll said it a while back, but I love this idea when you're thinking about kind of your own daily life that mood follows action. Sometimes we think that we need to fix our mood or get in the right headspace before we can go do X, Y, or Z, before we can speak out, before we can make a change. And it's actually the other way around. Um, Taking that small step starts to change your mood. Like you said, you feel more powerful, you feel emboldened, and then you take a little bit further. And I found that to be the case with everything from managing your mental health in these days to activism, that your mood is changed by just doing it. Take the step, even if it's a baby step, and get some momentum going, and it feels less overwhelming.
Well, tell us how we can find you and how we can support you.
I appreciate that. If folks are interested, I'm actually starting a new project as well. It's a YouTube show and podcast. If people are interested, my mailing list is at willpotter.com. It's just how it sounds. And there's an email list that's really low frequency, and all my social media, all that kind of stuff. But any help spreading information about that, sign up for the email and sharing this stuff online. My work has very much been a kind of grassroots effort over the years. And so I'm grateful to folks like you, Cheryl, for having me on, and every little bit of talking to people and spreading the book around and sharing the interview. It all helps. So thank you all.
Thank you, Will. This has been Will Potter, and I am Cheryl Moss, and we are Better Life for Animals. And if you have enjoyed today's conversation, Please like and subscribe so that we can create a better life for animals.
Thank you for joining us on the Better Life for Animals podcast. Together, we can create a world where all beings are treated with dignity, respect, and care. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you're listening. It helps us reach more people and spread awareness about the incredible work happening in animal sanctuaries. You can also share this episode with friends and fellow advocates to keep the conversation going. Until next time, keep speaking up, taking action, and making a difference for the animals.